Our next order of business is the census data presentation and introductory remarks by Kimball Brace, the Election Data Services. Mr. Brace, welcome to the committee. I know you've been here before and you have experience with this. Would you please give us a presentation overview on what we're in for? Thank you.
Yes, by all means. I'm going to take off my mask so that it comes across okay. I have been vaccinated, so even though you're more than 6 feet away, you should be safe from that side. My name is Kimball Brace. I'm head of a company called Election Data Services. We do redistricting all around the country, and we have been involved since 1979 in more than half the states of the nation, both at the state level as well as county level, city level, a lot of different governmental entities that have to do redistricting once every decade. Hopefully only once, depending upon what happens in terms of court cases and all of that. But I have done an awful lot of work in terms of compiling data. That is what we're specializing in. We also have testified in more than 75 different court cases around the country in doing different works of dealing with redistricting, both from a racial standpoint as well as overall district configurations. We have been long involved in Rhode Island, starting back in 1983 when we were brought in for the state Senate court case. We did not draw that plan, but we designed the settlement plan. And so we have continued to be involved with the legislature for each decade since that time. So we're now into our 5th decade of working in Rhode Island. My only wish had been that I followed my wife's advice of, we should have bought property up here a long time ago. So I know. For the past 4 years or 4 decades, we've also worked with the Secretary of State. We do a lot of work on the election administration side of issues. Everybody asks me, what do you do after, for the other part of the decade when you're not doing redistricting? Well, that unfortunately doesn't stop necessarily, but we get involved with state election officials, secretaries of state, and we've worked with the Secretary of State's office here in Rhode Island to help them in their whole maintenance and setting up of their statewide voter registration system. And we make use of that information and what we can do to help them out in terms of making sure that voters are in the right precinct and can vote for the right candidates. Because by the time you and I get finished here in the state, we'll jumble a lot of districts up and cause people to say, well, wait a minute, that's not how I voted for before. That's what happens with redistricting. We've also worked with many of the Rhode Island cities and towns in doing their own redistricting, their own ward boundaries, their own councilmatic district boundaries, and we've ended up providing expert witness services for those jurisdictions also in the state. So we have a long history in the state of Rhode Island. For today's discussion, I want to talk a little bit about the census and the census timetable. I want to show you some early works in terms of what we're seeing with the census data and what that means for you as commission in terms of drawing districts. Get into a little bit of the census data and data analysis. This is going to be a continual theme as we join together a number of times in getting you educated on what kind of aspects we're all going to be dealing with, be they data, be they geography, be they the law, be they lots of different processes and procedures on redistricting. And then we'll be able to unveil the website that we have set up for our Rhode Island efforts here. So from the standpoint of the census timetable, the original timetable that the Census Bureau has is by December 31st, the Census Bureau releases 50 numbers. Those are the magic numbers that say what is the population for each of the 50 states and is used for apportionment. It is something that we've been closely tied to in terms of reapportionment, because every year we take the latest announcements of population data by the states and come up with a new apportionment formula, a new apportionment calculation, and we put out a press release every year. Usually it fouls up my Christmas holidays because the Census Bureau likes to do it between Christmas and New Year's. So inevitably I'm working on a press release at that time. But we end up trying to show what is happening in terms of reapportionment. For any of those that have known me for the past 10 years, we have been saying that it's likely that Rhode Island would lose a seat, including even our announcements last year in terms of the apportionment stuff. And that was supposed to take place on December 31st. Originally, the time schedule from the Census Bureau was that 1 year after Census Day, so by April 1st of 2021 in this decade, they would release the block level statistics for use in redistricting. That is known as the Public Law 94-171. That is a piece of legislation that everyone will know the numbers by the time we get finished here. And that is the data sets that we all use. And they were supposed to be out a while ago. But then we had the virus and the delay. And the Bureau ended up going through an extensive process because a lot of their people that were supposed to go out and knock on doors to make sure that people answered the census, people weren't answering doors right around the census time. And so they had to revise their whole timetable and schedule, and that caused the data to come out later. So the apportionment data coming for each of the 50 states didn't come out until April 30th. That was when we found out for the first time that, lo and behold, Rhode Island will keep 2 seats, at least for this decade, as opposed to losing a seat. We were as shocked as everyone up here was, I think, on that side, because that was not the way the numbers were looking at. There may be some scenarios of why that happened and why that did, and we're exploring those, and we'll talk about those as we go forward over the next multiple weeks. But we got the data on April 30th, and Rhode Island kept its 2nd seat. So you get the choice of doing not only state Senate, state House, but also congressional districts as we move forward. The geography files that we use and that everybody uses in redistricting, those ended up coming out in February. And so they ended up showing up, and we've spent a bunch of time reviewing those on that side. So it wasn't just last week, it was in February where they came out. And so that gave us the basis on which all census data sits on top of. The census geography is basically a map of the whole state, showing not only the townships and the cities, but also what's called census tracts and census block groups. And down at the lowest level is the census block. It's like the block that we're sitting on right now. That is a census block. And the Census Bureau puts together numbers for each census block. That's what we use for redistricting. So that data started coming out in the legacy, what they called the legacy format, on August 12th. And so we have been making use of that to see what that data shows. Now, they will also be releasing next week on September 16th what they call the user-friendly format. Basically, it's the same data of what we got in August. They just did some more machinations and generating more tables and that sort of thing for a user-friendly format that will be coming out. But we have the numbers, we know what they are, and we've been making use of those to start looking at the state of Rhode Island. So from one of the things that we have done over the past multiple years in working with the state of Rhode Island is looking at the geography. And one of the things that we discovered in working with the geography and actually working with the Secretary of State is we took every single voter and their address and put it on a map. And you see here an example. But what we discovered was that there were a number of areas where the Census Bureau showed the town boundaries differently than what the town says is their boundaries. I know that's kind of surprising, but it was. What had happened is that the Census Bureau, when they moved to making use of the new geometry and the new geography, they failed to move the boundary of towns. And so what we got caught in, and we saw with the Secretary of State, is we had voters that we had coded in the voter file as being in town X, and when we mapped them on the Census Bureaus, they seemed to be in town Y. And so that's that little sliver between the red and the blue lines. That's just one example between West Warwick and Cumberland.
Kim, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. I'd just like the record to reflect, Mr. Clerk, if you would, that Mr. Reyes is now with us in attendance. Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry, Kim. Go ahead, please.
No problem. So what we were able to do is, as part of the effort that was an ongoing effort that we had with the state and we have with the Census Bureau, is we were able to get corrections into the Census Bureau. Because what that does is not only cause potential havoc for the registrars, for example, but it also causes havoc for the Bureau itself. Because if they didn't know where the town boundaries were, then they were going to count people in town X instead of town Y. And we didn't want that to happen here in Rhode Island. So we were very careful to try to get everything in line for once. I don't think that's me, but so we made recommendations and changes with the Census Bureau, and they did make changes in the geometry that they were recognizing, and we got those corrected, and they were reflected in the new Tiger files that were released officially for the redistricting. We also took a look at a number of areas in the state, and we knew that there was a focus on the ACI and the prison down there. And one of the things that we were cognizant of, with having done a court case here in Cranston, and also a court case in the state of Connecticut, of where are prisoners located and where are the prisons located. And what we discovered is that in Rhode Island, the geometry that the Census Bureau recognized was kind of coarse. And so what we were trying to do is make it a little bit more fine. And we put in a lot of these yellow lines that you see here that are the census blocks that we put into play for 2020. So that we have in this, in the case of the prisons, we've got finer tooth data. We did this in not only prison areas, but we also looked at it from the standpoint of the areas of the state. On the left-hand side, again, these are voters and voter points. And what we were seeing in where these voter points are, and this is an area here in Cranston, the yellow lines were the old census blocks. But we were seeing that if you looked at the old census block right in the middle of the map there, everybody on a whole bunch of different neighborhoods are all in that single census block. And that didn't make a lot of sense, because what it did is it took people in the neighborhood up on the top of the census block and included those with the neighborhood that was a long way away, all in the same census block. And so what we ended up doing is we used what's called back property lines as a way of further defining and refining the geography that the Census Bureau uses. So they took our suggestions and put in place, and this is able to now help us, as well as all the demographers in the state of Rhode Island, of getting better data for the purposes of any kind of study, any kind of, besides redistricting, just demographic studies of what's going on in their county or town or city, and having better sets of data. So we worked closely with town and city GIS entities to help try to get the data in a better shape. One of the things we also did is looking at, yep,
Yeah,
Sure,
Mr.
by all
yeah,
means.
Mr. Brace, I used to put in legislation, I don't know how many years, to do something. Yes, it is. Yeah, and it's always been a concern from my community, black and brown community, about, I think someone, I forgot, because I'm also in prison ministry. As a deacon, I go to the ACI at the medium one. But 029, 05, 029, 07, I think when they ran the zip codes of the prisoners there, a lot of them was from my community. And they were being counted in Cranston, and which a lot of people, including the ACLU, they consider that a travesty, because if you're from the South Side, 029, 05, 029, 07, you get arrested, then you go to jail, you're in Cranston. Where is the fairness in that? So based on what you just testified about, how is that going to work its way through, how is this data going to work its way through, and what we have to do?
Excellent question. In order to properly reflect the prison population, there is movement going around the country in terms of dealing with prison gerrymandering, is what they refer to it as. You may have seen that on that side. What it requires is that a state do an extensive bit of work ahead of time to be able to identify on Census Day what is the firm list of prisoners that are in prison, and with a valid address of where they're coming from. And that's usually, for states that undertake this, that's usually a 2 or 3 year process ahead of time. And so as of right now, it is kind of hard to put the data back into a different holder at this point in time, because we don't have what it was at the beginning. So it is something that certainly could be looked at and recognized for next decade, but it's kind of hard to implement it this decade because the data has already been compiled on that side. But I share your concern, Senator, that was certainly something that should probably be looked at in the future on that side. So one of the other things that we also did is looking at down between Cranston and Providence. The university, there were dorms that were being split by the town boundaries. Town boundaries hadn't changed. The university down there just built on top of where that town boundary was. And that caused a lot of headaches for the clerks in both Cranston and Providence. And particularly, how do you divide a building, in which rooms are in which town, for example? All of that kind of circumstance. We also had a lot of circumstance around the zoo of the area between Cranston and Providence, where old boundary lines had not been reflected properly. And so that was part of the effort of what we were trying to do and get people in the right place. It's something that we worked with the town clerks over the decade to try to get straightened because we were doing this work with the Secretary of State to get voters into the right precinct in the right city and town. But the university here in this picture is one of the problem areas, and I know the registrars have worked hard to get that resolved. Now that we have better capabilities of seeing on a map where buildings are and that sort of thing, it's a lot different than what some of us that have done it for a long time remember in the old days of maps that we had. So we've done a lot of things in terms of getting geared up for 2020. And as such, we started taking a look at when the data came out. This is what we're seeing in terms of the data from the Census Bureau and the change that's going on in the state of Rhode Island. And for anybody that looked at this over the multiple decades like I have, you discover that what took place over previous decades is a circumstance where we had population movement going from around Providence and going south, going down to South County. And we had that happening in several decades, actually. But this decade, we've got a reversal. And this map shows that. You've got a bigger gain up in the northern part of the state. Cumberland and all of those towns up there have experienced a great deal of growth. On the other side, the three towns that have lost population, Bristol we knew about. Foster is one that has come up a little bit more than what we had seen before. But the big change is Narragansett. And I don't know why that was, but I think that that's something that the commission should be looking towards seeing, because we do know that with the COVID and the problem that the Census Bureau had, they had problems counting people. Is that what happened in Narragansett, particularly with the university down there? Because at the time of COVID and the time of the census, you know, many of the schools let students out and they didn't come back. So is that what caused Narragansett to lose population? Unfortunately, that's the data that we have, but it does continue this reversal of what we have seen in past decades, of instead of people moving south, they're now moving north. That's going to impact what we do here in the commission and what we do in terms of drawing district boundaries. So what we have done is we've put together a whole series of tables, and there is a large packet of information on your table. I'm not going to go through all of this. I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but we'll spend more time on it in subsequent meetings. But basically what we have is we've looked at the populations of the counties and then the cities and the towns, and then we've looked at the deviations in the state Senate and the state House districts, because that's the data that we're going to start with as we look towards making changes of those district boundaries. So I'm showing you this in terms of knowing where it is in that table. And there are multiple copies of this for the public also, I know, so that people can see that and have that. Unfortunately, it is unwielding, but I'll ask you to bring it back when we come back together again. I apologize for that. But we did it that way so that you could read it, because when we print it out on 8.5 by 11, we all need magnifying glasses, I think is what it needed. So we have those, and there's some important things that is in that data. As I said, we're going to do some more in-depth at future meetings, and one of the things that we'll do is explain some of these column headings that are kind of strange. There's some guides at the beginning of the chapters and the beginning of the tables to help out, but we're going to spend at the next meeting a lot more time going through these so that you'll understand what they are. But the key thing for looking at redistricting is where is the shifts and where does the districts need to change. So here we've got, if we took the state's population and divided it by the number of state Senate districts, we know that we're going to be shooting for the ideal population of 28,878. That's a number that will be ingrained in your memory by the time this commission gets finished. I'm sure Stephen recognizes the number from 10 years ago and in all the numbers that we were coming up with all the time. So we're going to be shooting for this number for the state Senate districts. And what you do in looking at that is you look at the populations in each of the districts as they exist today and see where they are in terms of this ideal population of 28,878. And what we can see is where there are districts that are underpopulated and districts that are overpopulated. So on the left-hand side, it is the raw number of the deviation, with the underpopulated districts being in that gray scale. Those are the ones that are going to have to gain territory. They're going to have to expand because they're underpopulated. On the flip side, all those that are in the pink scale, those are overpopulated. And they're going to have to lose people because they've got to lose that overpopulation going to that magic number of 28,878. So if we look at this and we look at the map, we can begin seeing where all of the issues will probably be and all the differences that will come into play. And so for all those senators and reps that are on the dais, you're going to be real interested in these numbers. I know. This is a graphic depiction of what we're seeing in terms of the data and what data and what percent it is over and underpopulated. Now, if you look at the court cases, the courts have all told us that every 10 years we have to do redistricting and we need to redo the districts so that they are pretty equal. It's a careful choice of words, pretty equal. If you look at the congressional districts, the courts have told us that they have to be exactly equal, down to the individual person. So when we do the 2 congressional districts, they'll need to be basically the same number when we get finished with it, because they have to be evenly divided. It makes it relatively easy in Rhode Island because the towns in one district have stayed the towns in that same district. They haven't changed. The line in Providence is where the change takes place. So that's where the divide becomes in terms of the congressional districts in bringing those into balance. But from the standpoint of state senators and state house districts, the courts have given you a little bit more latitude. It's not exact population equality. It recognizes that there are smaller numbers that people are playing with from congressional districts. And so the courts have told us that you have basically a 10% overall deviation range. Now that's not 10% above and 10% below. That is 5% above and 5% below for the overall 10%. So keep that in mind. It can get to be a more narrower range of what you're looking for. And I'm reminded that indeed, if you take a look at, let me find the page for you all to look at.
And just if I may interject, if everyone on the committee looks at this handout, you'll notice in the lower right corner that there are numbers there. The print didn't come out perfectly, so some of the numbers are a little obscure, but the numbers start counting for 1 to 14 about halfway through it, and then they continue. So if any problems, just speak up and we'll get to the right page.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was here, and it's not, and I don't have, because this is on a different computer. I will get for you a table that is a beginning point for everybody to recognize. It is the ideal district size for state senate and the ideal district size for state house. And if you look at the 10%, what is the number above and what is the number below that ideal that we'll be shooting for? And you'll see in that table that the numbers are relatively small. So we don't have a real big window in order to get all districts in. Sometimes one little precinct will do it. Sometimes one little block will do it. The key to keep in mind, though, in redistricting is that if your district is the exact number that you want to have for state senate, 28,878, you think, geez, they don't have to change me. Wishful thinking. Unless you're in Block Island or you're in the corner of the state, everything else is shifting. And so you're going to end up shifting too, even if you have the ideal district size. So it is an important thing for everybody to recognize that you're all going to end up having to change some way, some maybe more than others, but you're all going to end up changing your district's boundaries on that side. That's what redistricting is all about.
Kim, I think Grant has something for you.
Yeah, it's not this one. Okay. But actually, well, yeah, 14. Okay, I've got one. If you look at, I think you might have this table, which is what I was looking for. It is at the beginning of the state senate districts. It is a table that looks like this. Well, it's page 1 of 14, but it's not the overall. There's 70 pages here, so I apologize. You'll find a number of page 1 of X, but we're looking at the state senate one.
It's right before the picture, if you look, right before the first chart. It'll say page 1 to 14. It's about halfway through the...
Yeah, it's about halfway through. It's right before
Yes,
the map. Yeah,
right before,
for the
there
state
it is.
senate.
That's
Yep.
everybody have it? All right, thank you, Kim.
Thank you there.
Yep.
Thank
Go
you,
ahead.
Ryan, for. So what we have in this table is this set of numbers that we all going to need to recognize. So with 38 senators, the ideal district size of 28,878, the acceptable deviation of 10%, that's 5% above and 5% below, what you have is an overall deviation window of 2,888 people. That's what you got to get within. But that means that it would be 1,444 above the ideal and 1,444 below the ideal. That's a tight window. You'll see if you go over to the state rep page, it's a lot tighter because your districts are smaller. So that's the kind of window that we're looking at. For state senate, what you're looking at is having to have districts between 27,000 and 30,000. So that's that 10% window. If you look over in front of the state house map, there's the same table for state house. And you'll see that we've got a window of only 1,400 people, of which you've got to be within 732 above or 732 below. So what you're shooting for is districts that are between 13,900 people and 15,363. That's a small number. You guys have a lot of members in a small state, and so your numbers are small. But it means that you're going to have to be extra careful in getting things to divide out right and to draw in right. So that's part of the key of what we'll be working on with you. But that's the kind of window that we're talking about. So from the state Senate, you can see where that difference is. And the state House, you can see again the districts in grayscale are underpopulated, and the districts in pink scale are overpopulated. And so the shifts are going to have to take place between those two. You can see clearly on the state House how everybody up in Cumberland and North Smithfield and everything else are all overpopulated, because remember, that's where the population was moving to. While we start getting down to the south, we start seeing underpopulated districts. So that's the kind of shift that we're going to be dealing with here in the state. Now, we're also going to be dealing with one other component. And this is kind of a part introduction of what we'll talk about next time. But looking at the data that we have from the Census Bureau, the census data shows us information on race. And they do that by having two questions in the survey, in the census survey. So the first question that's asked of everyone is, are you Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? And that is a yes or a no category. For most people, it's a no. But for the people that are yeses, they get a capability of looking at it in a further definition, that they could be Mexican, they could be Puerto Rican, they could be Cuban, or for the first time, this time, they're giving them more examples in the boxes of being able to write in that origin. Now, as I said, Hispanic is an origin. The Census Bureau recognizes it as an origin, not a race. Okay? And you'll see what we've got to do in order to get data so that you'll be able to understand it. But the census does ask the second question, and that is, what is your race? And they have 5 major categories. You could be white, you could be black, you could be American Indian, you could be Pacific Islander, you could be Asian, you could be some other race. Those are the magic categories that the Census Bureau tallies. And for the first time, they are also tallying more of the detail information that comes into play in what people wrote in the blank spaces. That is causing an issue with the data that we're seeing now. And we'll talk more about this next time. But just from the standpoint of the data and what is being asked, since the last 2 decades, you could check off all 6 if you wanted to. Before 2000, you had to pick one race. But what the Census Bureau discovered is that people are starting to have interracial marriages, all of that sort of circumstance. And so they opened it up so that you could check off more than one race. And what the Bureau ended up finding this decade is a lot more people checked off more than one race. Almost 300% more than last decade. And I'll show you what that causes in terms of some of your data in Rhode Island. So we've got a major shift in how the census conducted itself and conducted the census, problems with the COVID, but also some changes in how they went about asking people the race questions. So we'll show that a lot more. Now, as it relates to the major races that we do have, here's a map that shows at what's called a block group level. That is like a neighborhood.
Kim, what page you're on there? Just so I want to keep everybody on the...
This is not in your tab.
Not in there, that helps.
Not in there, yes.
So I don't leaf through every page.
That's right. I'm sorry. Yes, I'm glad you asked me a question. Good. Yes, yes. We just made these graphs this morning so that we can have for you. They will be on the website. This PowerPoint will be on the website and all that. So, but this shows the percent non-Hispanic white. Okay. Remember how I mentioned the fact that we have two questions. We have a Hispanic question and we have a race question. In order to look at percentages where Hispanics are taken into account, we need to pull Hispanics out of the race categories so that they're treated as Hispanics. And what that means is that we have non-Hispanic white population and non-Hispanic black population and non-Hispanic Asian population and so forth. But this way we can start having numbers that add to 100%. And I'll take you through those numbers next time and go into more detail on what some of these column headings mean as it relates to that. But for this purposes, what we wanted to show is where is the white population in the state. It's kind of knowledgeable in terms of the state. We know that the non-white is in more heavily in Providence, but we've got some pockets of non-white elsewhere too. And so we can look at where's the concentrations. We can also look at what it means in terms of the African American population. So this is down at the block group level, again, the neighborhood. What is the African American population down in each neighborhood? We'll be able to zoom down in to this, and you'll be able to, on our website, be able to zoom into this. So you can look in more detail about your neighborhoods and that sort of thing. But we can see where the population is from the African American side in this one. Again, there are pockets of African American that we need to take into account. You see some of it even in Newport around the base. You certainly see it in Providence and in Pawtucket and all of those areas. But you'll see some expansion of the African American population from what we had before 10 years ago. We also can look at the Hispanic population. Remember, we pulled the Hispanics out of the race, but that way we can look at the Hispanic population by itself and look at where the concentrations are. So we can see where the concentration is in the south side of Providence and the west side, southwest side. But you can see how some of that growth of the Hispanic, and we have seen growth in Hispanic. That was one of the major factors that came into play with the 2020 census. But now we can see where they are. And this is going to be important as we start looking at the districts and looking at the analysis that's required of looking at that. So we wanted to let you see where those concentrations are. We also have data because the Asian population is treated as a separate race. And so we can see where the Asian concentration is, you know, up in Providence on the east side, and in other areas. So there are pockets of Asian population that we may need to take into account as we're drawing districts on that side. Asian population is a protected class under the Voting Rights Act. So we need to be cognizant of that, as is African Americans and as is Hispanics. So we need to know where they are, and we can see that. I mentioned to you the fact of multi-race, and this is the map that shows where in the state of Rhode Island people chose more than one race. And you can kind of see, certainly Pawtucket is heavy in terms of more than one race. Over on the East Providence side, more than one race to a greater degree. So it's important to understand the dimensions of this. By having a larger number of people in more than one race, it means that on the straight race numbers, it'll bring it down because they were counted over in the more than one race. We'll go through next week how we've dealt with that and trying to understand that and show how we can show that determination. And that's in the tables that you need a magnifying glass to see. But we'll go through that so you can see. That's one of the major things that is facing all of us in terms of redistricting, is looking at the race. But one of the things that many people are starting to take a look at and pushing is the issue of communities of interest as a new way of defining areas of interest. It's a new dimension of things. It's an interesting dimension of things. And it's not totally defined. It's kind of let the user define what their community of interest is. We've been working in the state of Michigan in helping them in their redistricting. And they have a tool there that lets people come in and say, what is their communities of interest? And so this is the map that shows all the different communities of interest in the state of Michigan. They have, as of yesterday, 1,069 submissions on communities of interest. And you can see how there's stuff all over the place. So communities of interest will need to take into account and look at those, but we need to be cautious that there's a lot of different definitions of communities of interest.
Kim, Rep.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Chairman.
Yes.
could you give examples for the people that are watching live and for the people in the audience of what you would consider, what some people, like in Michigan, would consider a community of interest, so that we understand what that classification or category is going to be?
Good question. Communities of interest is partly in the eyes of the beholder, but in Michigan's state law and their amendment to their constitution, putting in place their commission that they now have in place, they have defined communities of interest. So it's a little bit more detailed, but it still gives you a lot of flexibility in how you want to define communities of interest. Is it area? If you think in terms of Rhode Island, community of interest would be the townships. Everybody recognizes what town they're in, and so that's a common denominator. But we know that geography already. Now that it's been corrected by the Census Bureau, certainly on the towns, but we have that definition already. So the issue is are there other things that people are looking at? It may be their ethnic area in their state.
We have a question. Rep. Newberry.
Yes.
Thank you. This may be the appropriate time to ask this question, but it ties into all this. There's a number of existing districts. I know at least 3 of the House members on this panel have districts like this, and at least 2 of the senators, and maybe 3, maybe more, I don't know their districts as well, where you have a district in 1 or 2 towns predominantly, and then there's 1 precinct in another town. And my question was relating to the numbers. I know we have state laws about precinct size, but what is the sort of minimum, when you get to the pocket problem, what's the minimum number of voters, or not voters, I guess, people, you want in a precinct? So we avoid or can look at those issues.
Right.
before.
That's a very good question. It is something that we're always very cognizant of. As I told you, we also wear an election administration hat and working with town clerks. And we have, for the past 4 decades, we've always set a rule in our office that the House can come in and draw the House districts. The Senate can come in and draw the Senate districts, however we're going to end up doing, or the various chambers. But we want the last 2 days before the bill goes to the floor to be able to overlay the two, because we want to keep the pockets, as the reps just mentioned, at a minimum. Because what that does, if you don't do that, then you have little tiny pieces of geography that suddenly there may be only 5 people in that because of the various, not only the state house and the state senate, but the ward boundaries that the city may have come into play. All of those things lay on top of each other and have the potential of creating pockets. So trying to
Newberry.
get those at a minimum.
No, I
he's gonna
appreciate, that's actually, that was part of my question, but I was actually more interested in what is the minimum, putting pockets aside, what is the minimum size you'd want for a precinct? When you have a
we
spillover into the.
Yeah, what we try to do is try to create pockets that are, have to have at least 100 people in them, if we can. And so that's the effort that we would try to institute this time too. So that
Thank you, Rep.
basically
Kim,
what
Rep.
you're trying to make sure is that you don't have a ballot that one person in this one little pocket precinct came in and voted, and then everybody knows how they voted. That's not what the American system is about.
Thank you, Kim. Rep Place.
Yes,
Question for you.
So, going with this line of questioning, what geographically, it had always been my understanding that you needed to move a census block. Like you could move, like one person. You can't just move one person to another district. You have to move an entire block or census block. Is that
Right.
the case, or do I have a misunderstanding on that?
You are correct. And one of the things that I'll be talking about next week is census geography. And census geography, when you look at a census block, it is a physical thing. It is something that is defined by visible features, is what the Census Bureau looks at. Is it a road? Is it a railroad? Is it a stream? Is it a river? All of those are physical properties that an enumerator, when he goes out to find that darn Kim Brace that didn't fill out his form, can put me into the right block. So it's visible features that they're looking for, with the exception that they recognize that city boundaries, town boundaries here in the state are not always visible features. So, but those governmental entities also form census blocks. So what you have is basically census blocks that are defined geographically, but not by the number of people that there are. And so census blocks, we'll have a table next week, shows you of all the census blocks in the state, how many have 0 people in them. There's a whole bunch of 0 populated blocks in this state. How many have 1 person? How many have 2 people? You know, usually census blocks tend to average probably about anywhere from 75 to 100 in most instances, depending upon the geography. It's a geography-based entity. Other levels of geography are better ways of defining. You know, block groups, which are collections of census blocks, tend to average about 1,000 people. Census tracts, which are the culmination of block groups, tend to average about 4,000 people, give or take.
Thank you, Kim. Rep. Diaz has a question for you. Go ahead.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Brace. I need clarification about community of interest. Are the neighborhood good example of community interest?
Yes. So being able to get definitions of neighborhoods would be very useful. Some cities do definitions of neighborhoods, and so that's useful. You know, if Providence has their own definitions of the neighborhoods, that's something certainly we can get and add that as a layer so we could see that sort of thing. City of Chicago does that. You know, other large cities do that. Not everybody does, but certainly if there's some sort of neighborhoods that you can define. Now, if you remember the map that I showed you of that part of Cranston, where we created new census blocks to try to reflect those neighborhoods, that set of cul-de-sacs coming into that block, that people there tend to know everybody there, that's kind of a little neighborhood. It's not really connected with the people that you got to drive all the way around to get down to that part. That was in that same census block, but we divided that out. So that's the kind of thing to help try to define neighborhoods on that side. What we've done here in the state, many of the demographers here in the state are seeing some value of what we created there so that they get better definitions of neighborhoods on that side with now using the census data. Because after all, the block groups are what forms the heart of what is more detailed data from the Census Bureau.
Thank you,
for
Kim. Chairman
incomes
Phillips
and
has a
that sort of
question.
thing.
Go ahead, Chairman.
Yes.
More of a comment, I think, since we met at the conference in Salt Lake City, Utah, concerning redistricting and that.
Right.
And part of my understanding for the community of interest could be as simple as, let's say, an arts district, because Providence has got a sizable arts district, and that
Right.
could be one of the communities of interest.
Of interest.
At least under my understanding. Maybe you have a different understanding than I do. You've been doing this a lot longer than we have.
No, and those are good examples. I mean, all of those are good examples. The issue is how do they overlay? And do they overlay? Do they conflict with each other? We're seeing that in Michigan a lot. So you almost have to go through each communities of interest individually to start to understand what people are talking about on that side. So that's part of what we're doing in Michigan on that side too. I want to announce, and hopefully we're connected internet-wise. So let's see. Yep. This is the redistricting website that we've set up for the state. It lets us take a look at data, and you can. Oh, that's true. So how do we? How can we get that flipped over? Good.
Just mirror your screen?
Yeah.
Want to mirror your screen?
Sure. Yeah.
Just,
Kim, if you would, I need glasses to see everything today, but I can't. Rep. Phillips and I have problems with the end of that. Does that say .org? O-R-G?
Yes.
All right,
.org.
just wanna be clear.
.org. Yep.
let me see, I'm gonna-
There we go. There we go. Okay.
Hit escape.
Good. Thank you there, Nick. I'm sorry. I thought you could see my screen. Yes, that's right. So this is the website that we've set up, redistricting.org. And it has a number of pages, basically. We can look at some of the census data. So all of the data that was in this book is now up there on the website. So you can go there and look at it. You could probably zoom in a lot easier than you can maybe on on here. Excuse me there. But you can pull those up there. And the maps that we've shown to you today are up there separately. And we'll put up the racial data additionally up there tonight so that it's there. We have an area for your meetings, and when the meeting gets over, we'll be able to post the videos up here of each of your meetings so that we can have a one-stop place that all the redistricting commission meetings will be shown at. We'll have a capability of seeing and having a contact information. People want to send comments or that sort of thing here. And there is not only the website, but we're going to put together a calendar so that all of the meetings and the regional ones that we're going to conduct around the state will be here on the calendar, so that we'll have one place where you can all go to find out where we're going to meet next, but also everybody else can see it too.
Now, Kim, on this webpage, who is going to be monitoring it? Who is going to be running it? Where you just showed where you had somebody that maybe want to ask a question about it, and they put their name and their question and everything in there. Is it your people that are going to do it and disperse it to the commission here so we understand what questions are being asked?
Yes, it will right now be sent to both Ryan and myself, but we can add other individuals than where it could be directed to, the chairman, for example, co-chairman, or all the commissioners. We've got that flexibility of saying where do you want these comments to go to. So certainly we can do that. Yeah.
Because I think everybody would like to, at least on my part at least, on the commission here, would like to know what type of questions are being asked by the public.
Absolutely.
So we can make a better, intelligent decision on what maps we need to draw.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So that's some of the things that I wanted to explain to you today. That was probably a lot longer than I thought it was going to go. I apologize. But you can see there's a lot of information here, and a lot of information that we'll be talking with you about over the next multiple weeks and months as we go through this redistricting process, both in drawing districts and really understanding the data and understanding how it can be analyzed and looked at, both from the standpoint of demography as well as voting patterns on that side. So those are all the kinds of things that we'll be getting into as we meet on a regular basis.
Kim, thank you. Rep Diaz, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brace, at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that you was referring to different census release, indicating day and time when those releases were available. Mm-hmm. Is there any chance that we can find those releases at the website, or any way that you can compile those information for us? It's just for the sense of comparison information. Thank you.
We're doing different things to help in that comparison. The maps are one way of doing with it. Looking at comparisons over time is another way. But we will be linking to this a website that we've set up called My Districting. And that will let you look at plans and look at the whole state and be able to zoom in to the areas. to see what you want to see on that side. So that is one other mechanism that we'll have that'll link to this website. We'll send you over to the My Districting page that we've set up offsite that will have all of that kind of plan information, comment information, all of that kind of capability would be there, and you could see it on a map.
Thank you, Kim. I appreciate your opening remarks and your overview. I think all of us found the insights very helpful. I know this is the first time for me. I know Rep. Ucci's run the committee before, but it certainly was insightful. Before we move on to public comment, is there anyone else who has a question for Kim at this time? Anybody from the committee? Hearing none, Kim, thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you there.
We'll move on to our public comment at this point.
Indeed.